Hey guys, there was some recent news about this Palestinian guy out of Columbia University who was detained by ICE a week ago. And ICE initially detained him for violating the terms of his student visa, and later found out that he's actually not a student, that he's a permanent resident with a US citizen spouse who's pregnant. The pregnancy is irrelevant for this discussion, but what I actually want to talk about is whether or not it's lawful for the Trump administration to detain someone. Oh, by the way, he's detained now. So he's in an actual prison facility for ICE detainees. These detention centers are actually prisons that rent out space to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So when you hear detention, what's actually happening is the person is in a jumpsuit in a physical prison being managed by prison guards and subject to the same schedule generally as prisoners in most detention facilities. So he has a green card and he's currently in a detention facility. And the question becomes, is that legal? And I actually had to do a little bit of research because my first thought was, how is this legal? He's a permanent resident. He hasn't been convicted of any crimes, but as it turns out, there might actually be a legal basis for the Trump administration to do this. So we're going to discuss that first, and then we're going to go through a list of other reasons for which a permanent resident, which is to say a green card holder, can be detained and deported from the United States. So I admittedly don't know a ton about this situation, but my general understanding is that this person was leading some protests in support of Palestinians at Columbia University. And what the Trump administration is alleging is that he was offering material support to a terror organization. And by terror organization, I'm referring to Hamas, which has been designated to be a terror organization, not only by the United States, but by many other countries, and not just by the Trump administration. This happened a long time ago. Hamas is clearly designated as a terror organization according to the United States. So the first question I have is supporting or endorsing a terror organization after you become a permanent resident a basis for deportation? And the answer is yes, it is. And that might sound obvious to some people, but it wasn't really that obvious to me because the Immigration and Nationality Act has very specific reasons for which you might be found inadmissible, which means you're not able to become a permanent resident from the start. And there is a terrorism bar there. That was clear to me. I knew about that. But I actually didn't know that once you become a permanent resident, engaging in regular free speech can get you deported from the United States, because this seems like a clear example of free speech. And I could be wrong, and this might be a situation that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. But the question becomes, is free speech entirely allowed by a permanent resident if that free speech is used to endorse a terror organization? I wouldn't be entirely surprised if this case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court actually invalidates some parts of the Immigration and Nationality Act. I would not be surprised. I'm not predicting that's what's going to happen, but let me just read to you what the terrorism bar says. So as a permanent resident, you can be deported from the US if you have engaged in or appears likely to engage in terrorist activity. That seems pretty reasonable. Or has incited terrorist activity, also reasonable. Or is a representative of a terror organization or group that endorses or espouses terrorist activity. Representative of terrorist organizations should probably get deported. That's all reasonable. But they said endorses or are a member of a terrorist organization unless that person proves that they had no idea of its terrorist aims. Okay. Or, and this is important, or endorses or espouses terrorist activity. That phrase right there, or endorses or espouses terrorist activity, might be the Trump administration's strongest argument. They could say, like, this guy endorses Hamas's activities, they engage in terrorist activities, and for that reason, he's deportable, and therefore we're detaining him. And the reason we're detaining him is because he's a danger to the society that he lives in, so we want to keep the public safe, so we're going to detain him. Let's just keep reading. Or receive military type training from or on behalf of a terrorist organization, or are the terrorist's spouse or child, if the relevant activity took place within the last 5 years. So that's the entire terrorism basis for removal from the US. I think the strongest argument that the Trump administration has here is by arguing that this guy endorses terrorist activity, but that sounds awfully close to impeding on free speech. In fact, the guy, from my understanding, I don't know all the facts here. I'm just some guy on YouTube making a video who happens to know a lot about immigration law. My understanding is that he was engaged in protests, which sounds like it's protected by free speech, but those protests may have endorsed terrorist activity. So anyway, this is an interesting cross-section between what's protected under the Constitution and what's prohibited under the Immigration and Nationality Act. And whenever there's a conflict between a law created by Congress and the Constitution always wins. So this is a super interesting one. I'm very curious to see what actually happens with this matter. For now, the guy continues to be detained. So whether or not it's a lawful detention or unlawful detention, he still has to deal with the consequences of being detained. So here in front of me, I have a really long list of all the reasons for which a permanent resident can be deported from the United States. I don't want to bore you guys, so I'm just going to go through some of the interesting ones, but there are many reasons for which a lawful permanent resident can be deported. And if you want to get this whole list, just Google summary of who can be removed based on grounds of deportability. All right, guys, so I want to talk about a couple other ways in which a permanent resident can be deported from the US. Some of these are interesting and vague and create a lot of wiggle room for the government to deport large numbers of people. I've just picked maybe 20% of the total ways in which someone can get deported for this video. So I'm just gonna go through a couple of them that I think are interesting and which people might find interesting. So the first one is committed marriage fraud. So I tell people in all of my videos that you should not commit marriage fraud. You should only apply for a green card based on marriage if it's real. And the reason is because if you're found to have engaged in marriage fraud, even after you become a permanent resident, you can be deported. Even after you become a citizen, they can denaturalize you and then deport you from the US. There's a section of the Immigration Act called 204C. If there's a 204C determination made, which is for marriage fraud, you cannot fix your status in the future. It's game over, pretty much. There's like a very limited exception that 99% of people do not qualify for. So if you're thinking about getting into a marriage fraud situation, I know a lot of people are considering it because of all the pressure that Trump's putting on immigrants right now. I would rather you be unlawfully present in the US than engage in marriage fraud. I think the risks are higher with marriage fraud. That's just my 2 cents on that specific topic. The next way you can get deported is if you were convicted of a crime involving moral turpitude that was committed within 5 years of becoming a permanent resident, or if you're convicted of 2 crimes involving moral turpitude at any time. They can be outside of the 5-year period. A crime involving moral turpitude is a special classification made by the Immigration and Nationality Act. It has nothing to do with whether your conviction under state law is a misdemeanor, felony. It doesn't really matter. It could be a very minor thing, but it could have serious immigration consequences. And the great example of this is theft offenses. Theft offenses are actually unique. They are another classification of immigration crime that we're not going to get into right here. But, you know, I give people the example that stealing $1 can get you deported, whereas in most states, a DWI will not. And so it's not intuitive. Certain crimes are considered very serious under immigration law, even though society doesn't consider them to be serious. And other crimes that we would consider to be pretty serious, like I would consider a DWI where you could kill someone to be pretty serious, are not really serious under immigration law. And the reason why is because most DWI offenses in most states do not have an intent element. You do not need to intend to be drunk driving. You don't have to even intend to have consumed alcohol. The mere fact that the key is in the ignition and you're sitting in the driver's seat and there's alcohol in your system is all the government needs to prove. And theoretically, as a cop pulls you over, if I just inject you in the neck with alcohol, that's a DWI in most states, which is why it's not considered a crime involving moral turpitude. If you ever have any criminal convictions or you're dealing with a situation where you're being charged with a crime, if you're a permanent resident, or even before you become a permanent resident, you need to speak with an immigration lawyer in addition to your criminal defense attorney to try to figure it out so that you can take a plea deal that doesn't have immigration consequences. Another way you can get deported as a permanent resident is if you've been convicted of high-speed flight from an immigration checkpoint. So that's a fun one. If you are, or at any time after US admission means become a permanent resident. If you've ever been a drug abuser or addict, no actual court conviction is needed to be deportable under this section. The person's own confession to drug use or evidence on a medical report could be enough. And I've seen this happen. Here's one. If you've ever been convicted of domestic violence, stalking, child abuse, child neglect, child abandonment at any time. And you know, the DWI example I gave earlier, if you have a child in the car while you get a DWI, that's oftentimes child abuse or child neglect, depending on the state you live in. Domestic violence is its own classification of deportable offense under the Immigration Act. Very serious. Stalking might not seem that serious. A lot of people harass other people and they're convicted of stalking. Can have really intense immigration consequences and can get you deported. All right, we're skipping over a bunch of them, getting to some of the other fun ones here. Okay, this one I was really shocked to read. This was news to me. Being present in the US would create potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences. If you, by being present in the US, would create potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences, you can lose your green card and be deported. Let me give you an example that I'm just gonna make up right now. Let's say you're from Ukraine and you have a green card and Trump wants to deport all the permanent residents to appease Putin. And he argues that there would be potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences if he allows Ukrainians with green cards to remain in the US. That could be a basis for removing large groups of people from an entire country. Now, I don't know how this would actually be challenged in court. I'm sure some challenges would be successful. I don't actually believe that Trump's gonna do this. I don't think Ukrainians with green cards need to worry about this happening. I'm just giving an example. If you use the words that are in the Immigration and Nationality Act and you take them to their logical extreme, that's what I believe could possibly happen. Another one here is within 5 years after US entry, you've become a public charge for reasons that did not arise after their US entry. That means that you were a public charge all along, or the conditions for you to become a public charge existed before you became a permanent resident. You didn't just run into some bad luck right after you got your green card. Those conditions existed before you got your green card, so you can be removed for the public charge grounds. So, well, I wouldn't advise anyone, permanent resident or not, to become a public charge. Sounds like a bad way to live, but you can actually get deported if you become a public charge. And the last one I'm gonna mention here is if someone has voted in violation of any federal, state, or local law. An exception is made for people who, based on their parentage, reasonably believe themselves to be US citizens. This exception is very limited in scope. Most people will not qualify for this exception. If you vote, you can easily get deported from the United States. So all the people who think massive amounts of undocumented immigrants are voting, first of all, those are not permanent residents. We're talking about permanent residents here. Get your facts straight. But I also don't actually believe that's happening. Why would someone do something that's gonna get them deported intentionally? And also, I don't get why a permanent resident would ever illegally vote and then vote for Trump. Doesn't make sense, but actually, never mind, because massive amounts of Hispanic voters this time around voted for Trump, even though it was not in their best interest. That's my opinion. Take what you will from that. All right, guys, that brings us to the end of today's video. We discussed a couple ways you can be deported as a permanent resident, and more disturbingly, some of the really vague language that's in the Immigration and Nationality Act that could be utilized to deport large numbers of permanent residents who've actually done nothing wrong. I don't actually believe this is going to really happen on a large scale, but I wouldn't be entirely surprised. And just know that if something like that did ever happen, there are large groups of lawyers that work for nonprofit organizations such as the ACLU who are on standby ready to challenge these policies of the Trump administration. If you guys are interested in videos like these where I digest different parts of immigration law and I explain how they could be affected by Trump's immigration policies, be sure to subscribe. I try to put out 5 videos a week on these types of immigration topics. I also discuss a lot of topics related to family-based immigration, naturalization, and deportation defense. But for now, since there are so many things changing, I'm focusing on Trump's immigration policies. If you're new to my channel, subscribe. If you actually need assistance with family-based immigration or naturalization, you can find my information in the video description below. And I'll see you guys next time for another video.